This is the first of two programmes under the title Excluded because of race. Nate Tinner Williams, co-founder and editor of Black Catholic Messenger, warns us that in the USA, the era of Catholic social teaching has become the era of Catholic social bleaching. And then Sister Makareta from Aotearoa, New Zealand, introduces us to her river, the Wanganui, which was granted legal personhood in 2017 after 100 years of litigation by the elders. She reminds us that when the river is well, we are well, for we are the river and the river is us. And then we have a glimpse of a documentary about the struggle to protect the Wanganui, Voices from the River. Finally, Taiaiake Alfred, a Mohawk writer and political strategist from Canada who was raised a Catholic, shares his experience of his enforced enculturation as a young man. He talks of the re-emergence of Indigenous spirituality in the 60s and 70s, and today's Indigenous spiritual quest for unity.
Friends and comrades, I have but one message for you, and that is this. The spirit of mutual dialogue is in the air. Right now in Rome, hundreds of bishops, priests, deacons, consecrated religious, academics, the youth, and many other people are gathering to discuss what they feel are the adjustments that need to be made in the Catholic Church. Even our siblings of Christians and other religious traditions have gathered to witness what is sure to be a historic Synod of Bishops. They are, of course, discussing the Synod on synodality. But here, in our space, we are even more focused on a topic of great concern to the majority of the Church, a topic we can only hope will not be only addressed here. We need to talk about human rights. The very concept of human rights in my country, the United States, is often a forgotten one, or at least one that is seen as a problem out there, to the north, to the south, in the middle or the far east, but no, not right here in our own backyard. Not here in America, where mass incarceration of the poor and unprotected runs rampant, especially against my people, the descendants of the formerly enslaved. No, human rights is often not the word we use for the chained and the bound, who may be sentenced to life or even lose their life at the hands of the state. No, we don't call it an issue of human rights when the very principles of an equal democracy, an equal education, an equal right to move and travel and be and flourish for Black people, my people, is constantly under threat, as it has been for centuries in this land of the free and home of the brave. Ironic, isn't it, that the land is stolen and the climate of fear fuels everything that can truly be called racism. Yes, my country is a land of fading human rights and massively inhuman wrongs. Tragically, my fellow citizens also believe they live in a Christian country. A country that, in many places now, pledges allegiance to God immediately before bearing false witness in history lessons, allegedly protecting the emotions of some of the children in the room by erasing the human rights abuses perpetrated against the ancestors of their classmates. Yes, the people of this land are confused and have not yet come to terms with their wicked ways, their unchristian ways. I, Nate Tinner Williams, the grandson of Catholics and the great-grandson of the enslaved, am a journalist, a Catholic journalist. In my research and writing on the Black Catholic community over the past 3 years, I have seen and covered over and over and over the outworkings of these hideous abnormalities. And on not so infrequent occasion, I have been appalled to learn that, for some reason, It seems to be my own co-religionists that are the culprits. Catholic court justices ruling in favor of death while claiming to be pro-life. Catholic politicians running on platforms of hate and revisionism. Catholic priests calling my people and our allies maggots and freaks. Catholic bishops remaining silent all the while, as the least of these are left to bear the brunt. It seems that the era of Catholic social teaching has somehow now faded into an era of Catholic social bleaching, where the world and the church is to be made more holy by being made more white, by ripping apart the very fabric of human dignity so that it can be bought and sold on the black market of power with political currency. Indeed, I must lament my own church. I must often reprove my own church in my writing and in my actions. I must often turn away from my church just to get a glimpse of my own God, the suffering, brown, migrant Jesus Christ. But what has all of this to do with mutual dialogue, you might ask? How can doom and gloom and the elephant in the room possibly lead to an authentic conversation on conversion? Well, I believe that as the church proper gathers to discuss what it feels are the issues of the day, and as we sit here on the outside and wonder what can really come of it, we must arm ourselves with the pure and persistent weapon of witness. We must use our minds and our mouths to speak and to never allow ourselves to be silenced in the fray. The very same church that claims it is now ready to listen must be faced with the full bore of what we have to say. The Synod on Synodality itself collected witness from around the globe, from the oratory to the outskirts, supposedly seeking the lost sheep to hear too what their voice can muster. But it's not enough. It is not enough because the very apparatus by whom the voices were to be heard, the U.S. church hierarchy, was only minimally interested in the project, still very much chained down by their opinions on what is wise and what could lead to error. Simply put, they cannot handle the truth, and so they stopped their ears. When Black Catholics told them they were most concerned about racism, they relegated us to a comment and a summary that will, above all, ostensibly achieve their own objectives. When we told them young Black Catholics do not feel at home in a church stained by unaddressed slavery, segregation, and suppression, they shrugged and closed another round of Black churches and schools. When we told them that we must speak for ourselves from the level of the parish council to the halls of bishops to the courts of Rome, they gave us decades of lip service and continued on their way. Yes, my people are still awaiting the Good Samaritan who will pass by our way. The priest and the Levite have apparently chosen their own path. Alas, the true dialogue continues. It cannot be mediated by the hands of a church priest or secretary or bishop, and it certainly cannot be contained within the discussions of a month in Rome. It will require ongoing transformation at a grander scale, that which will upend the system of silence and sin and fling open the door to a new pathway of flourishing. A diverse but not diffuse witness of all the church's cultures, languages, expressions, theologies, liturgies, and leaderships. We cannot remain in the place that we are, or we will perish. For my part, I will continue to write, to shine a light on the Black Catholic witness and the need for authentic change on the part of the church towards its African American members. I hope you will read. I hope you will think. I hope you will speak out. The time for true dialogue is now, and the true place for it to occur is wherever you are. O Jerusalem, wash thy heart from wickedness. that thou mayest be saved from thy deception. How long shall thy vain thoughts lodge within thee, O Jerusalem, keeping thee from perfection?
You'll find me with the broken and the weak, in the spaces in between. You'll hear my voice cry out with those who weep, only if you're listening. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do it unto me. You'll find me with the ones without a voice, the forgotten and ignored. My blessing is on those who love the poor. Will you open up the door? Whatever you do for the least of these, you do it unto me. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do it unto me. Hallelujah, hallelujah, He is among us. He is among us. Hallelujah, hallelujah. He is among us. He is among us. Hallelujah, hallelujah. He is among us. He is among us. Hallelujah, hallelujah. He is among us. He is among us. By this the world will know the Father's love. We will know the Father's love.
Greetings to you all. My name is Takahia Makareta Tawaroa. I belong to the tribe of Ngā Pairangi, one of the many tribes that live along the banks of Te Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River. The river was our first road, our first lada, our first wash house, our first playground, our first baptismal font. We are named after the river. Our identity comes from the river. Our well-being is related to the river. We are river people. Over the last 100 years, our river has seen many changes. Vast areas of land around it was cleared, creating erosion and sedimentation. Our river has been poisoned by pollutants and toxins of all kinds. It has been used for industrial waste, stormwater, wastewater, sewage disposal for well over 100 years. Our waters have been diverted for hydroelectricity. Plans and policies by official authorities have been exploitative. The overall effect on land, water, and people is still largely unknown. Māori people who lived along the river for a very long time were virtually ignored. So that our river would be respected as an elder or tupuna, our old people went through every court in the land for over 100 years. And even when they lost a case in one court, they would take their case to another court. The case for the Wanganui River is the longest litigation in the history of our country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. In 1990, our elders lodged a claim before the Waitangi Tribunal, a commission of inquiry that makes recommendations to the government. They produced a life-changing report, and only then did we start to see real progress being made. On the 14th of March 2017, the Te Awa Tupua Wanganui River Claims Settlement Act was passed into law. The Act said that the Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River, is an indivisible and living whole, comprising the river from the mountains to the sea, incorporating its tributaries and all its physical and metaphysical elements. The Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River Act, was a landmark case for the rights of nature, granting the river legal personhood, or as our people would say, the river is our tupuna, our ancestor. It is part of our human family, and we are part of the river family. Ko au te awa, ko te awa, ko au. This is one of our sayings, which means that we are the river and the river is us. Our river has its own mana, its own authority, its own modi, its own life force, its own identity, its own spiritual values, which we as a people embrace as part of our culture. It is the Māori worldview that makes this act unique. Today, the care and well-being of our river is gaining momentum across our local community. For example, here in Wanganui at the moment, the Te Pūwaha Port Development is a good example of a project that is mindful of what the Act says. First of all, it is inclusive. The wider community is involved in the plans for the port, in line with the legal status of Te Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River. The status of the river as Te Awa Tupua as an ancestor, a living being that sustains the land and the people, implores us to work more collaboratively and to keep the well-being of the people and the river at the heart of every project. Our people say, when the river is well, the people are well. Ko mātou te awa, ko te awa, ko mātou. For we are the river, and the river is us. Thank you.
Ka timata mai ai tō tātou awa I runga oki o Tongariro. Ka eke, ka eke. Ngā manga iti, ngā manga nui e ono kauana. Ka tupu, ka tupu. Hei awa. Hei awa tupua. E ara I ta wainoi o. E awa tupua.
Our people used to come down into Whanganui from the upper reaches and middle reaches, and they used to tie up down by the river's edge here, and our people used to come into Pākaiture and stay there for several days. The council and others are saying that the land was sold and that they have a deed to prove that it was sold. We dispute that deed.
There was a law passed in 1894 called the Validation of Invalid Land Sales Act, which said that no matter how Pākehā got Māori land up until that time, whether it was legal or illegal, under Pākehā law henceforth became legal.
I think it's quite easy to live in the shadow of dismay when you go back to Ngāti and know that there's 22 streams that have been diverted and that the Māori has been sucked out of them.
When we began to talk about coming to Pākaiture, it was more about our awa and the fact that we'd had a claim, you know, the longest claim in the history of this country.
With the awa tupua, there's agreement that it will have its own legal personality.
And so us coming together is an affirmation that we never lost our relationship to here, and we're now affirming it with a strength of presence.
So lovely to get on the water again. So much fun.
This is going to be less of a lecture and more a series of thoughts and reflections and trying to tie together for people's understanding what the spiritual dimensions are or impacts are of the various movements that have shaped Indigenous communities, that have changed Indigenous communities, and are shaping and changing Indigenous communities, and hopefully Canada as well. Because we've been given a green light to talk about I don't know more and to politicize things towards the end as we move forward in time from the 18th century through to the 21st century. But full disclosure, starting off, I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church. I grew up Catholic, baptized all the way, confirmed, and hoped for priesthood by other people, but it never happened. And so I am a Catholic in terms of my upbringing, and I did go to Jesuit school, so blame the Jesuits for any kind of misconceptions that I'm going to throw at you today, and any misunderstandings of doctrine or religion. It's totally their fault. I never read the Bible, being a Catholic, being educated by Jesuits, so I just have whatever the Pope told me through those priests, and that's what's in my head about my understanding of Catholicism. But I'm also a member of the Longhouse within my community, practicing and participant in the spiritual life and the religious community of the Haudenosaunee as well, and fully taking that into my being. And have kind of in my life moved through both of those to a place that I'm looking to explore in the work that I'm doing, and in a very new kind of approach to lay out for you today. And I think that my experience, if I may say so, is reflective of the experience of many Indigenous peoples. I don't want to kind of generalize and say it's the Indigenous experience, of course, but I think that many Indigenous people, certainly the ones in my own community, my own nation, and the ones that I know and have been associated with, have made that similar journey. And the first question that I'd like to deal with and reflect on is why. You know, why have people, maybe I should even take a step back while some people are getting situated here, which is no problem at all, come on. I'll take a step back, and just for those people that are not familiar as an area of expertise or of their own knowledge as to the history of Indigenous peoples with churches here in North America, take a step back and lay out in a very basic way my understanding of the relationship at its earliest stages between the churches and Indigenous peoples, and why it was that Indigenous peoples took on Christian religions. Later on, of course, now people have taken on other kinds of religious practices as well and belief systems. But I think overwhelmingly the experience has been one of Christian missionaries in their interaction with Indigenous peoples here on this continent. The question of why has always got me, you know, because as I was growing up, I grew up in the 1960s and 70s in an era of cultural revitalization and increased pride, and a very strong statement of pride and cultural relearning for Indigenous peoples, and especially in the Mohawk community. The resurgence of our religion and our spiritual beliefs was so strong that I kind of questioned, well, how did it fail in the face of Catholicism? How did it fail in the face of the missionary activities of the Jesuits in our territory? And I think that the question that obsessed me for so long that I actually wrote a dissertation on it. Like part of my dissertation is in trying to answer that question. I mean, my first book, what's called Hidden Voice of Our Ancestors, it was an investigation into the political and cultural history of the community of Ganawage. Basically, how did Ganawage, a community where I grew up, which for some of you may know is a very active, strong, politically assertive community, come to be the way it is? And one of the basic questions that I wanted to answer for myself was, you know, how did Christianity impact our sense of ourselves? How much are we Mohawk in the traditional sense, and how much are we Christian? And for me, growing up, as I mentioned at the outset, in my earliest years, it wasn't really a question, you know, who we were, because we were Mohawk Catholics. We were Mohawk Catholics, and it was just as Mohawk in my grandmother's and my great-grandmother's experience, and the one that was given to me in my early years growing up, to be standing there, robed, participant in the Corpus Christi parade that was, I'm sure, reflective of anyone who's been Catholic at that time in that place, led by a bishop and so forth. It was just as much Mohawk to be doing that as it was to be playing lacrosse or speaking the language or anything. And so in the early stages of our existence, or my existence, there was really no question. I mean, they were so intertwined. But as we entered this phase of trying to define ourselves for ourselves, you know, we started to have to ask questions of ourselves. You know, what is it about us that makes us Mohawk? And with that, how do we disentangle the Mohawkness from the Catholicism and the culture that comes from being Catholic in Quebec in that period of history? And so for my dissertation, I investigated that thoroughly. And one of the answers that I came up with, and I'm not meaning to be conclusive on this, I think I've said it 3 or 4 times now. I'm investigating, I'm starting this here. I'm not as confident as I normally am on some questions that I lecture on. And so I'm putting these thoughts out there. One of the answers that I came up with was that because the particular set of teachings that were brought to a very strong and vibrant Indigenous community, being the Mohawks in the 1600s and the early part of the 1700s, were not seen as anything threatening. There was kind of a syncretic response on the part of the people that are my ancestors. And so the teachings about the Christian God and the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and their relationship and the stories that went into that, and the kind of philosophy, the worldview that it created was, in fact, something that they could accommodate. It was something that they could accommodate. I forgot to bring my book. If anyone has a copy of Heeding the Voices of the Ancestors, anyone of my students? Sorry. I was going to read out a really good quote, so I'll have to paraphrase it now. It wasn't my quote, it was actually a quote from someone at the time observing, how it was that the Mohawks came to accept it and why they so willingly embraced it. It became so strong in terms of their Catholicism, and it had something to do with the fact that the original belief system and the religious practice and the spiritual outlook of these people was so democratic, so individualized, and so reflective of individual preference and relationship to spiritual beings and the earth, and your relationship was basically created out of your own individual experience with nature and so forth, that someone coming in and giving you another perspective was not seen inherently as a threat. And people took it on in terms of rationalizing it in terms of their worldview, and to put together a worldview that was based on originally Owanio, the great good spirit, and Jesus and Mary and God was not inherently conflictual because Owanio was undefined. It was a mystery. And in fact, I think I still stand with the best English translation of Owanio or any one of the original words from indigenous languages for the Great Spirit is the Great Mystery. And I think Vine Deloria, a religious scholar from the Lakota people, has written about this as well and has characterized it that way. And so it's not as profound a challenge for them as it was. It was not as profound a challenge for them as it was for me later on, to accept this and to integrate it in a syncretic way. And so to pick and choose elements in order to build a spiritual practice and an outlook, and then to integrate that into your way of being was not a particularly difficult thing for my ancestors to do. And I think they did that. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is more temporal, in the sense that religion is always tied to a political power. Religious missionaries coming into our territory were not recognized simply as teachers or bringers of a new vision or medicine people. They were also recognized as French. And to the extent that they represented French power and the extension of the French state or the kingdom at that time into our territory, they were accommodated, rejected, or embraced. And in my dissertation, I showed over time how the Mohawk people were kind of intrigued in the way that you might be intrigued by a philosophical dialogue with a person coming into your territory at first. And the quote that I was going to read was about a philosophical debate going on between a priest and a Mohawk elder. And actually, there's a whole book written on this by Georges Sewi, a colleague of ours, called The Teachings of Lahondan or something like that, if you're interested in that philosophical debate aspect of it. But the first instance, I think, was intriguing. What is this new idea? Is it a deeper way of understanding the spiritual world? How can I integrate that into my practice? I like this part, I don't like that part. How can my language, that kind of thing. But over time, because of the fact of the changing political and material realities of Indigenous people, the Frenchness and the political aspect of the religion took on a much more important, became a much more important factor in that relationship and their relationship to Christianity. So you see over time in regard to the Mohawks, and I think this is probably generalizable among many, many Indigenous people, is that it went from that kind of engagement on an intellectual and spiritual practice level to one where they really had to accommodate the political objectives of that church. So it went from being a spiritual question to a political question because the church was then imposing itself in their territory, and they had to recognize what is the relationship of the church to the French state, to the French kingdom. What is the relationship of the church to their ideas about land ownership? What is the relationship between that priest and that commander of that army unit, more specifically? And over time, Mohawk people came to recognize, as I showed in my dissertation, that there was a certain advantage to being allied and to being Catholic be allied with the French and being Catholic. Basically, over time, what you find in the part of the world that I come from is the gradual evolution of two competing empires. And I think in large part, the Haudenosaunee people, which are the Iroquois or the Six Nations, and certainly for the Mohawk people, the fact that I'm still here identifying as a Mohawk, the fact that there are still Mohawk communities and the Mohawk language being spoken is in large part due to their sophistication and their ability to stand between two empires and to construct an identity that allows them to play one empire against each other, one set of beliefs against each other, one religion against each other, and to take those in as much as necessary without allowing it to remake entirely their identity and their way of being. So Paul mentioned the work that I'm doing in Alfred. This is a sister community of ours. One of the things that we found in working there and looking at cultural change over the years, admittedly in relation to another issue, which is pollution, physical contamination in the community. But part of what we did was look at the history of that community as a whole. And it's remarkable. There's a lot of remarkable Native communities, but in our communities, and Ganawage, how they managed to take on the identity of a Catholic, how they managed to take on as the French language to a large degree, but also to decide almost subconsciously, and this is the way I refer to it in my book, subconsciously, what parts they needed to keep in order to remain, in their view, Indigenous, according to their own self-conception of being Indigenous. And they were very strategic in how they thought through this and what they took on. And so the key element there is in the choosing, and them being in charge, them making the decision, them being the ones to sit and sift through all of these influences and these new influences, and to essentially recreate their identity every generation as it goes forward, or every 2 generations as it goes forward. The key being they were the ones making the decision. And so it doesn't become a completely colonizing process until that change process is forced on them, until the options are completely limited, until someone comes in and tells you, you have to do it this way. You cannot refer to it as Owenio. It has to be Jehovah, those kind of things. And I think that at that point, that's just one example, but at that point, it becomes a situation where the community, the person finds themselves in a very precarious situation, because then their identity is being reshaped by someone else. And so when it comes to religion in the community of Ganawage, they always felt, even as I was growing up, that, like I said earlier, that they were Mohawk and Catholic because they had continued to take on aspects which they valued and reject others. I can remember, this is an anecdote, I can remember all growing up, but even into my 20s, this is after I was in the U.S. Marine Corps too. When I got out, we always had this ceremony, which I never quite understood. I thought it seemed kind of crazy. And if there's anyone else that does this, maybe you could fill me in the springtime, to bless the water. Maybe religious people have a sense of this too in the Christian tradition or Catholic tradition. To bless the water, they would erect a big pole, a tree, and they would hang different things from it, symbolic, sacred objects, for maybe, fertility, artifacts or something like that. And then there would be a ceremony where people would take it and shoot guns at it until the tree was cut down by the gunfire and fell. And then all of the things that were hung in there were taken as kind of objects that people valued after, either spiritually or just materially. And I participated in this all my life. And I didn't really understand what it was until I did my graduate research and put some thought into it and research into it and found out. I guess the reason I tell this story is because I was proud that I finally won. The last guy that gets to shoot and the tree falls down, you're the special blessed guy that day, I guess. And you get the special honor of taking whatever you want from there. But participated many times, never actually won except for that one time after I became a Marine. But then I went back and I one shot. Came back and then I did some research and I found out that it is actually, unless someone tells me they have exactly the same ceremony somewhere else, but I'm pretty sure it's it's an example of that syncretism where it's a blend of the two. And so originally they used arrows and there was fire. It's a kind of a symbolic representation of in the Haudenosaunee tradition, but then it was adapted by the church. And I think maybe this is a particular strength of the Jesuits in their practice in Quebec because of the doctrinal liberty that they had at that time to be able to adapt the teachings of the church to the Mohawks in particular. They were given a special dispensation, understand, by the Pope at the time, to actually preach and to conduct a mass in Mohawk. And then from that led to a lot of liberties, as you would say, with the established doctrine of the church in terms of the liturgy and all that kind of stuff. But I think that our community is reflective, and my experience is reflective of that experience. The change occurred, I think, when, and I talk about this a lot in a political context as well, but I realize it's also reflected in our spiritual practice, when over time, of course, as you engage in this process, you move from a universe, basically, that's completely shaped by your indigenous understanding and worldview and cultural practice and language and experience, to one that is half and half or a quarter, and then so forth. And then you add the political influence, the modernization aspects, and so forth. And you get a situation now when you come into the 1970s or so forth, where the cultural grounding of the people that are engaging in that kind of give and take and making those decisions is nowhere near what their ancestors was. And so it's a point that I make again in relation to apostles, but it stands here as well, that to be able to negotiate this kind of process of picking and choosing, it's an entirely different thing for me to be doing it in 1972 or whatever, from my cultural standing and my level of understanding of our language and our spiritual universe, than the Taiaiake, the guy with the same name as me, in 1608. I mean, his universe was completely shaped by his understanding, and taking one or two is nothing. For me, I barely have anything because of the impacts of colonization over time, because of the long-term impacts of that process of giving and taking, mostly giving, and then for me to be able to take a little more, the impact is that much more on the person. And so what we have is either by design, I have to imagine there was some design in it, but from the perspective of our people, over time, it does become forced acculturation. Because even if it's not a policy on the part of an individual, if an individual is not coming at it with that design, if a religious order is not coming at it with that design, if the church doesn't have that design, still, over time, it comes forward as forced acculturation because you don't have any other choices. Language has been eroded to the point where it's not functioning anymore, it's under threat. The memory of those other ceremonies and so forth has been lost. Add to it the active suppression that everybody in Canada knows happen on Indigenous language and ceremonial practice. And you get the situation where it's forced acculturation. And so then it becomes colonial, and it begins to be felt as colonialism too, because what you feel is that you're not living, and you don't have access to the true identity and the true spiritual connection that defines you as a Mohawk person. And I think this is something universal among Indigenous people, is that, you know, what we're left with then in the 1970s and 80s, from my experience, but I guess the timeline is different in different communities, is a situation where you have knowledge of religious practice. You grow up with it, and of course they're authentic in that respect, but you're faced with a movement among people in the 1970s and 80s telling you that that is not authentic Native practice. Some of them your relatives who have gone away from the religious complex of Christianity, rediscovered their roots, reconnected with people who have never really been fully assimilated to that, and now holding out a standard of indigeneity to you to say, that's not right. You know, you're mimicking. You are living out the fantasy of the Jesuit. You are living out the fantasy of white society. And all you know is that religious practice that is Catholic, whether it's syncretic, whether it's a mix mash or whatever, but it's definitely not the Longhouse, which is the next thing I want to talk about. Because in that context, what we had was a bit of history here, 70s and 80s, after a long period of cultural decline, survivance, I want to say, first of all, I should say. Decline in terms of the numbers of practitioners, the strength, the widespread nature of our practice, but Also, very tenacious holding on by certain families within our communities of those practices and of those beliefs and so forth. After a long period of their survival, of persecution, of oppression and suppression, you had, because of bigger forces going on in the society, civil rights, Black power, decolonization in Africa and Asia, France Fanon, and all of this, you had this kind of rebirth of the idea of the Indigenous person. And I was lucky enough to grow up right in the middle of all of that. I was born in 1964. So 1974, 75, 76, coming of age and recognizing all of this and seeing it play out in the context of our communities all over North America. But seeing how it played out where people had rediscovered the idea of Indigenous and wanted to remake themselves. So what they really wanted to do was begin to make the choices for themselves again. And you really do see this at that stage of the evolution, I would say, of the religious life of the community of Vanuatu, but also all over North America. You see, 1970s, Red Power. Red Power had a spiritual dimension as well. It came to be known, and for those experts and those who lived through it, excuse me for simplifying here, but we're pressed for time a bit here. But for lack of a better word, it's kind of a pan-Indigenism. Okay? Pan-Indigenism. For two reasons, I'd say. One was very strategic, in the sense that if you're going to try to build a movement of Native people rising on the idea that only the Native people in any particular community are going to be your polity, your group, you're going to have a hard time after 300 years of dying, and 300 years of epidemic diseases, and 300 years of depopulation through adoption out and all these kind of things. So what do? You start to have a reconstruction and start to make choices about your identity that are based on a broader conception of what it is to be Indigenous. So Pan-Indianism, I think, is a broader conception of what it is to be Native. Red power. It's not Mohawk power, Ojibwe power, or Dene power. It's red power. It's a racialized conception of what it is, which is entirely different from the past. Okay. It used to be, if Ojibwe saw a Mohawk, heard a Mohawk speaking in his territory, he'd probably club him over the head. And same goes for the Mohawk, But now we all get along great. We all love each other. And this is an outgrowth of the idea of the Pan-Indianism because it's a survival tactic. And the spiritual dimension of that is that you have to have a religion and there has to be a spiritual base that is unifying. Right? It's unifying. And the unifying aspect of that is what we know now today, I think, as Indigenous spirituality. It arose out of the 60s and 70s because what we have are people, and excuse me again, I'm kind of simplifying, sweat lodge, smudging, the pipe ceremony, all of these things are not only practiced where they were originated from anymore, with Plains people and Ojibwe people, but they're practiced by everyone. You can go to Friendship Center here in Victoria, you can go up north, you can go anywhere, and you'll find that, and that is part of the outgrowth of this rise of Indigenous people in the 1960s and 70s, and this cultural and spiritual share. Well, cultural sharing, but the spiritual notion that we are all connected, that we are all one people. And so that was part of it. And part of the rising of the Indigenous people in that phase was to accomplish that political objective of unification, strength in numbers, and so forth. So again, just like in the French era and the conquest of the Mohawk territory, there was the alliance of spiritual power and political power. Well, Mohawk people and Indigenous people everywhere recognized this as well. And so to create something that was a spiritual foundation was absolutely necessary. And I'm arguing that there was a lot of thinking and strategic thought that went into this as well. And I think John Trudell is kind of emblematic of this era, and all that. And Gary Farmer was here. Those of you, some of you may know Gary Farmer, and said he just got off the phone with John Trudell and talking about Idle No More. And John Trudell said, well, there's never been a revolution that wasn't spiritual. And it's true. I mean, if you're going to have a revolutionary movement, whether it's to internally revolutionize the life, the identity of Indigenous people, or to try to revolutionize Canada, there has to be a spiritual foundation to it. And I think that in the 70s, what you found was an effort to kind of revolutionize the way Indigenous people thought of themselves, kind of to de-Christianize them. And so a lot of Indigenous communities, and my community as well, kind of did it in a reactive way. And so they self-consciously created an Indigenous identity based on a lot of sharing of practices and so forth. But what I found in my own research and in my own experience too, is that there was a lot of legacy of Christian thought and behavior, especially if Catholic thought and behavior, that transferred over into those new forms. And so I mentioned the Longhouse. We had the revival of the Longhouse, and I think that this is parallel across a native country too, where you had the kind of next step was the resurgence of what was seen to be authentic Indigenous religious institutions and practices. So, first came the Red Power, the rise of pride, the activism, the confrontation, the taking back of choice and identity and decolonize it in that way. And then, well, if we're going to be our own people, we need to resurrect our own institutions. And so recreating the Longhouse in our community was the way it was done. And it was done in different ways all across North America. But to stick with my example of my own community, the problem was that once you're raised Catholic, you're pretty much Catholic all your life. And, you can call yourself Mohawk and you can call yourself Haudenosaunee, but you're still going to exhibit a certain Catholic judgmental attitude. Everybody knows that stuff. So it's a running joke. So the fact, I'll just give you one anecdote in relation to this as well. So when people revived the Longhouse in art, they did an awesome job, I would say. I don't know how they did it, relearning the language, the ceremony, from people who had held out for generations, and reconnected with them, and relearned and reestablished against all these odds and pressure, even internal pressure within the community doing that. But there still was one thing that I always remember in going into the Longhouse is that, you had to take an oath kind of. You had to grasp the wampum to kind of declare that you are no longer a Catholic. And that kind of struck me as very Catholic. So that's just a anecdote. And it kind of goes all the way through. And of course, I'm talking about this 20, 30 years later, and everybody realizes this now. And it's not seen to be a bad thing. It's the evolution. It's the choices that we made. And people are looking back on it now and saying, well, how do we continue on this journey of authenticity? Let's not judge our ancestors two generations back for making us grasp the thing and saying I'm not a Catholic. That's what we needed to do at that time. You had to know who your friends and entities were, and all that was a revolution. And that's what they thought needed to be done. Now, to move it forward into time, skipping vast periods of time and many interesting stories and interesting happenings, just to get to the conclusion so we have a discussion. We find ourselves at a period where I think you have a situation where you have a younger generation of people who have to a much greater degree exposure to education and exposure to other people's beliefs and intermingling intellectually, socially, and spiritually with other communities, both in Canada and globally, that it becomes difficult for them to even relate to those traditionally revived institutions. And so we've kind of gone through this situation now where the younger generation they're not drawn to the Longhouse so much as a site of spiritual power and so forth. They're like everyone else, they've been modernized. They know certain things about science, and they believe science. They know certain things about physics and the way the universe works. The spiritual aspect, the ceremonial aspect, the kind of the mythical aspect are not the things that draw them, but the thing that does draw them to it is the power of it in terms of how it connects them to each other and connects them to that original objective in Indigenous spirituality, which is to the land, to the spiritual forces, which are the true governors of this world. And so we're kind of like back to the beginning in terms of what young Indigenous people are looking for. They're less religious, in my view. And I know this because I have 2 teenagers and I have a 5-year-old, and then I teach younger people all the time, like many of you do. And whereas my quest was to understand my community, to understand the church and its impact, to revive these cultural institutions as a site of authentic Indigenous being, they're not so concerned with that today as I think understanding their relationship to the earth, understanding what is proper conduct in relation to other people, and it's less religious as it is spiritual. And so there's more of a true spiritual quest on the part of people, and the younger people can tell me if I'm wrong or right or whatever, but I don't really see that many people coming to our program or when I go speak in communities so concerned with getting it right in a doctrinaire sense or being part of a movement that validates you on whether or not you're doing the right ceremonies, saying the right things and things like that. They're very much concerned with the idea of the power that is inherent in nature, very concerned with understanding what God is, what the spiritual power that governs this universe is, and understanding what are the teachings that are going to allow me to integrate proper conduct and right living according to that law and that universal law. And so that, as I understand it, was probably more reflective of the idea of our ancestors' spirituality than anything that's happened since in terms of religious doctrine or church. And so the challenge for us as parents, as teachers, as community leaders today is to try to understand that ourselves and then to try to provide the means for the younger people in our communities to access that. And then also, as is the theme of my remarks so far, to ally that to a political cause, or to at least make it consistent with political objectives that are in the minds and reflective of needs in our communities. And that's where Idle No More comes in. I think that you see with Idle No More, and I don't want to limit it to Idle No More, because I think Idle No More is kind of a campaign or a reflection of a broader movement on the part of Indigenous people. And hopefully it's a continuing movement towards the restoration of true Indigenous nationhood in this country in partnership with the people who have come here since we did. And so the newcomers and the original people in a renewed relationship of trust and friendship and respect. That's the goal. But Native people are orienting today around a spiritual quest that is still oriented towards achieving unity, but that is also challenging of the established churches, but also the established orders within their communities that are reflected in these traditional bodies. And I see that in my own community. I feel that instinct in myself. You know, I keep throwing anecdotes at you, but here's another illustrative one. I participated in Longhouse. Like I said, I used to be Catholic, went through that, the Longhouse revival, fully involved in that as well. But have kind of moved away as well towards what I'm talking about here because of a number of either intellectual crisis or coming to realization type events where, and one is very illustrative. In our culture, in our spiritual practice in Mohawk and Iroquois generally, dreams are very important. They're almost the main facet of our religion. In fact, some anthropologists have written about that. You know, it's all about their dreams and interpretation of dreams. Our main ceremony of midwinter used to be all about people telling their dreams and acting them. And there was a whole culture built up around releasing the emotional and the spiritual energy that was being conveyed to you in your dreams. And we still adhere to that fundamentally. And so I had a series of dreams that I won't go into detail, but in the complex of our religion, we're supposed to have given me a responsibility and thus an access to a certain society and their ceremonies and songs and so forth. But when I went to the person who was responsible for initiating people into that, and bringing them and educating them, and bringing them that, the first thing he asked me was, "Do you drink beer?" And I said, "Of course I do. I'm a lacrosse player." "You know that?" And he goes, "Well, I know that." And he goes, "I used to drink beer too. But if you go through this ceremony, if you ever drink a beer again, it's going to kill you. So I just want you to know that." Well, all right, good talking to you, but I don't believe you, and I'm not going to do it. And no offense, but I really don't think that's true. And I said, I think we had a big discussion about alcoholism and all this stuff. And so I got out. The main point of the question is I went to someone else in another community the same story and the same thing, and her idea was completely different. And she said, no, that doesn't matter. You know, it's your intention in coming to it. The experience you had proves that you need to do this for your own self. And I went to another person, and he said, well, you don't even need that formal structure. Here's what you say, here's what you do, here's the medicine that you need, and you go and you do that. And then that final conversation was the one that was like turning for me. I was like, well, maybe the formal structure of that religious institution that we now call the Longhouse is good for some people. My friend sitting there, maybe he needs that formal structure. Not so formal for that other person that I talked to second. The third person obviously feels that it's not important at all, because he gave me the medicine and the teachings, and he said, go and do it on your own. And it worked. And so my conclusion at the end of that experience, it happened over a period of months, was that everyone needs to make their own choice in terms of their spiritual practice. We don't live in a universe anymore where complete uniformity is demanded. And I think that that's the challenge. It's both an opportunity and a challenge for our movement, because if it is where now there's so much knowledge, so much opportunity, so much diversity to choose from, there's also the challenge of how do you maintain that basic unity and that basic cohesiveness in a culture which is grounded in a spirituality as well. And so I don't have the answer as far as what the proper approach is going to be for the younger generation, but I know that it is a challenge, and I know that what we're doing, I'm confident in what we're doing, and pointing them back to the land and pointing them back to their experience in a natural environment, guided by the ceremonies and teachings that we understand having helped us, experience having helped us, and offering them the opportunity to experience the spirituality through their experience with the land that is authentic to being Indigenous, and then they can make their own choices as they go forward. And it comes back to the land all the time, and I don't think there's anything more Indigenous than that. What we're doing in Idle No More, and I think moving forward beyond Idle No More, in terms of Indigenous nationhood movement and continuing that struggle, is to give Indigenous people the opportunity to live out their lives in their homeland and to experience in a material way, in terms of living in a culture on the land, and to experience the spiritual power of nature in their territory in order to remain Indigenous. And that's a political objective, but it's also a spiritual quest on the part of Indigenous people that I think that we desperately need to continue, or else we're going to find ourselves forced into another type of acculturation, which is not so much religious at this point, but materialist. And next thing you know, we'll just be Indigenous on our iPhones, and we'll be clicking like Indigenous all day long on Facebook, but we're not going to be Indigenous because we will never have experienced the power of nature that defines Indigenous people's relationship with O'Neill and the Great Mission. So, now I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have some conversation.